Hey guys, welcome to the DarshanTalks recording and podcast. On this podcast, we discuss life science, legal, and regulatory issues, especially in the context of medical affairs, clinical research, and promotional compliance. If you like these videos and podcasts, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You know you want to. This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on PRC review, MRC review, developing SOPs, training, audit compliance, and more. Reach out to Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. Or you can just visit our website at DarshanTalks.com or visit the law firm website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm really excited. I get to have the Mo Alsumidaie, and I already butchered that, and I'm gonna have him. I practiced it like 3 times before we started, but even then I butchered it. But I'm really glad to have Mo on. Mo and I have been connected on LinkedIn for several years at this point. He's an incredible sort of person we connected to because he knows so much. So I'm really excited to talk to him. The first time I had him on, we're hopefully going to land up talking about patient recruitment and enrollment. But I think that it's one of those topics that is very easy to free flow into other topics. So we'll find out. But Mo, before we get started, do you want to introduce yourself?
Happy to. Thank you again, Darshan, for having me on your show. My name is Mo Alsumidaie, and I'm head of research here at Clinibiz. And we're a integrated research organization and a CRO that uses automation technology and AI to make clinical trials more efficient and affordable. And personally, I've worked in the industry for more than 16 years now. I've worked in big pharma, and y'all can take a look at my LinkedIn profile for more details as to where I've worked. And thank you again, Darshan, for having me on here. Look forward to discussing more.
This is sort of a really interesting topic, right? Mo, we're talking a lot about this idea of patient recruitment and enrollment. Now, let's start from the beginning. Why is the burden of patient recruitment and enrollment on sites? Is it better placed on sponsors?
Actually, I think it is a better place to be on sponsors. The reason I say that is because protocols have become a lot more complex compared to where they were today. For example, you can take a look at Ken Getz's research on the topic. The number of protocol amendments have increased. The complexity of clinical trials and the procedures of clinical trials in study visits have become a lot more complex. And based on what we were seeing, especially from the site side and the site's perspective, is we have a lot of studies coming in. The PI believes that the IE criteria look fine. We can enroll patients, but when we get into it and we actually start to pre-screen patients in our databases, sure enough, the protocol is way too complicated, and it takes a lot of effort for the sites to go through that. And the problem is that a lot of sites don't have the resources to focus on recruitment because the risk-reward benefit sort of starts to weigh in here. Like if the sites, for example, the coordinator is spending way too much time trying to find that needle in the haystack, they're not going to really focus on it if the pay on the back end isn't going to be much. So what happens is we see this all the time, and I admit my sites even do this, is what's called study deprioritization, which means that the studies that are overly complex and too tough to enroll end up losing focus at the site, and the sites focus on studies that are easier to enroll in.
So that's a really interesting perspective, right? So the idea is the difference between a theoretical site and the practicalities of running a site. Because what you're talking about is, if I'm a sponsor, I'm going, the reason I got you as a site is because you told me you have the patients, you have the subjects. You're now telling me that I need you to promote and send me subjects. Well, why did I bring you in the first place? So how do you respond to sponsors who think like that?
Well, the sponsors don't really ask us those questions because it's not only our sites that are having the issues. we know that all the other sites are having the same issues, right?
Right.
So we're not the only ones. So sponsors do bring in assistance, and they do bring in some help by, bringing on recruitment firms to refer patients over. The challenge we've seen with recruitment, however, is the quality of the patients. They do some general pre-screens, like you have web form pre-screens, and you have phone pre-screens, but oftentimes the depth of those pre-screens are not exactly the best. Like you need, for example, medical review. You need in-depth analysis into the patients and the medical histories to evaluate whether or not they pre-qualify for the study. So it's oftentimes lacking that medical review that's necessary for a higher chance of enrolling patients.
Which is really interesting because I've spoken to a few different enrollment companies, and I've worked with a few, and as you would imagine, they talk about how they have really robust practices and they use all these sort of Web 2.0 technologies to bring in subjects. And what you're pointing out is that's great. You have more subjects, not more appropriate subjects, and that's the distinction. But you guys do it, obviously, and you do it at the site level, and you still manage to get patients and subjects who are right. What do you do differently? Is it the fact that you put in the medical review part that helps with eliminating everything else? So talk to me a little bit further about that.
Absolutely. I mean, coming from the site side, I can tell you that, firstly, talking to a healthcare professional really makes a big difference. And also, if you take a look at Ken Getz's research in terms of, approaching patients in pharmacies, if you can even take a look now, CVS and Walgreens are getting into clinical trials now too. The thing is that it really establishes that trust needed to engage the patients. And it also depends on the disease indication too. For example, psychiatry, neurology trials, you get a lot more engagement compared to dermatology trials, where patients are kind of like floating around. Oncology is very different too. When you're recruiting for rare disease oncology, that's a very different animal, right? Because you're really dealing with most of those oncology trials are rare disease now. So one thing we do is we engage the patient with automation. For example, when the patient first gets enrolled they respond to our website. And once they respond to the website, they go through a variety of different pre-engagement icebreakers, we call them, where they receive emails, texts, automated phone calls, before they receive a call from our pharmacist who's on staff who does a pre-screen with those patients. And so by the time that the patient is done with the pre-screen by our pharmacist, in all the trials except for oncology, we've got an 80% chance of actually enrolling in the trial. So by the time the coordinators get those patients, the coordinators don't have to do much work. We know what the patients have gone through. They get the form. We also split the pre-screening process into forms. So the forms actually undergo sign-off through every stage. There's the orange form, which is the pre-screener form. So we know that, that's documented. The coordinator gets that form. Then there's the green form, which happens at the site before the patient consents. And then the blue form, where the rest of the IE criteria are gone through after the patient consents, because you can ask patient-specific information until, after they consent, for example. So that has worked pretty well for our sites. We're starting to expand that. We're working with several sponsors now, like rare disease oncology. That's, we are finding that needle in the haystack. And it's not only finding, pre-screening patients, it also has to do with how you target your advertising strategy to get those patients. You can, for example, target, pancreatic cancer, right? You could go on social media. Well, that medium doesn't tend to work well for that particular disease indication. So you go to Google Ads, and then you find which works better, videos, image, or keyword searches. Then you have to re-optimize and continue to, teach the learning algorithm to get it to a point where you actually are getting those patients. So it's a lot more complex than you would think. But I do know that other recruitment companies are also doing similar things, right? Like, this isn't new. I believe there's a company that is now using nurses to do pre-screens as well. So the industry realizes that there are these challenges in protocols getting a lot more complex, and they see the need for medical pre-screens before referring the patients to the sites.
So, I mean, there are like 1,000 questions I can get into based on what you just said. So I'm going to try to pick individual ones as we pick through it. So my first question, you have a very successful IRO, and that's wonderful. And for those people listening in, please check out Mo's IRO, CliniBiz. So definitely have that conversation. You made I'm a pharmacist, so I obviously have a vested interest in asking this question, because people ask me this question all the time. Because as pharmacists, they go, how do I get involved in clinical research? And usually it's very difficult for them to realize that just having a pharmacy degree doesn't mean you can get involved in clinical research. There's more to it. You actually made and especially because pharmacists can make over 6 figures working in retail pharmacy. Nevertheless, you made a concerted effort to go with the pharmacist in the pre-screening role versus a nurse who can, from a pure financial perspective, cost less. Why did you make that decision?
We did that. It's an interesting approach. We started out working with Rutgers Pharmacy School and working with interns starting there. What we did notice is that having pharmacists really understands the medication history in a lot more detail and understands the mechanism of action of medical products a lot more. So, when oftentimes, for example, like when a PI says, oh, this is a good patient, they look at the patient as a whole, right? Whether they're likely to respond to this particular medical product and this particular mechanism of action. And I think that's where the pharmacists really come into play, right? These pharmacists are going through their residencies, right? And they're learning a lot about how patients interact with specific medications. But when we introduce them to these novel mechanisms of action and introducing that to their existing education, we started seeing that the referrals were actually really good, and we're aligning with the PI's perspectives on whether the patient is going to respond well to the medical product or not. And so we did start seeing a lot more alignment with the PIs as those pharmacists started to learn. And as they graduated, they started to continue working with us on these particular initiatives. So that's kind of how it all started. And I think that's one of the key differences between a pharmacist and a nurse. Now, granted, we haven't worked with nurses on this in this area, but one thing that is clear is that they have a very rigorous approach to understanding how patients interact with medications from a pharmacy standpoint and from a PK standpoint also. So I think that's the advantages here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Let me ask you a different version of the question. You talked about this really elaborate, really interesting pre-screening model. I've worked with smaller sites, and what they usually will do is they'll throw out a single ad that'll go onto a bus terminal or something like that, or they'll put out something that's a few Google ads and go, I'm not having any success recruiting subjects. You actually have gone like multiple steps further. You've got the orange form, the green form, the blue form. You've got a actual screening process after that. Can we talk a little bit about just the difference between pre-screening, screening, and then enrollment? For those people, including myself, I mean, I've worked in this industry for 20 years, but from my perspective, I've negotiated screen failures, but talk to me a little bit further. Explain pre-screening versus screening. What do those two words mean, and why are they different?
So pre-screening is essentially the process of evaluating the patient against the study's inclusion and exclusion criteria within the IRB's approval, which means certain things, for example, conducting an assessment that is study specific, like taking a look at, for example, the tumor type, the genomic type of the tumor, that has to be done after consenting, right? But whether the patient has cancer or their age range or the medication history. So when you do a general pre-screen over the phone, you do a general pre-screen to weed out most of the patients, right? When you get to the site, that's where you start building the relationship with the PI. So you're not only testing whether the patient has all of the information that was collected on the pre-screen, but also evaluating the patient's commitment to the study. Do they show up to the visits? Are they likely to stay in the study? How committed are they to the research? And then at the same time, we do a more in-depth pre-screen. We really take a look at the medical history. We obtain the HIPAA release form and confirming that the patient actually did take those medications, that they do actually have that condition. And then after the patient undergoes the consenting process, then you do clinical trial specific assessments like blood draws and taking a look at their, certain levels of their medication, or whether they're, for example, if they have diabetes, for instance, what the A1C looks like, things like that. So that's the difference between the different stages. And by doing it in a staged approach, it really not only conveys process to the patient, which means that you're consistent, and to the sponsor as well, that you have process, but also conveying what the expectations are. What are the next steps to the patient? What are the next steps that are going to happen? And by taking this approach, you're not bringing in a bunch of patients, scheduling your entire day, and you are, sort of overwhelming your coordinators. You're essentially turning the process into a business process that is scalable, right? Consistent and scalable. And so there are expectations. The coordinator knows that the patient has passed this particular screening process. By the time they're screened, there's a good chance they'll enroll because they've undergone a really rigorous pre-screening process. So that's what this assures.
So maybe you can start from the beginning, because you said something really interesting to me. You said that in the pre-screening process, you're still starting out under the auspices of the IRB. And you're basically saying we start asking these questions that have been approved by the IRB. I guess in my head, I'm starting with the question, why is the IRB technically involved when the subject is not a subject yet? What wouldn't the and again, I'm asking this question, and I'm going to ask more people this question because it's an interesting question to me. Wouldn't the IRB's oversight begin once the subject is a subject, i.e., they've finished the screening and they've been enrolled? If there's a problem that happens prior to, would you, for example, report the adverse event? And I would argue that you don't have to report an adverse event of someone who's not a subject in your study. In the same way, then why would you have to be subject to the IRB requirements if they aren't part of your study yet? So talk to me a little bit about that thought process.
It's a great question. And everyone knows the purpose of an IRB is to ensure patient safety and well-being. Yeah. Well-being, I'm highlighting here as well, right? When you create your advertising materials, the IRB has to approve it. And that is something that happens before the patient is even screened, right? Sure. You have to make sure that you're not manipulating patients into clinical trials. It has to be an ethical way of doing so.
100%.
Like another example would be the study website, right? How you brand it, how you name your study, the shapes and icons that you use, the images you use, what you write on there, how you describe the medical product. Those are all things that have to be approved by the IRB.
Right.
And those are all things that assure the patient's well-being, right? Like, for example, in 2013, was it? Remember when India shut down the entire clinical research industry because they, was it the ICMR felt that the
It was the result of a Supreme Court decision, but yeah, ICMR was sort of
yeah
overseeing it, and they basically said that there's too much subject sort of coercion, if you will, that was happening.
right, manipulation and abuse of subjects. That's what they felt, right?
Yeah.
Now the details, I don't really know what happened exactly, but IRBs are there to protect against that, right? Like, for example, if you're targeting a specific minority who might be vulnerable, right? And you're coercing them to be part of a study, like that's what an IRB protects against. So that includes pre-screening patients and the questions that you ask them, right? Those have to be IRB approved. At least we submit those to the IRB to ensure that there is sufficient coverage, that there is approval, that there is no coercion happening. And by following the process, we are following the IRB's approval for what they consider appropriate content and questions to approach the patients with.
It speaks to a really good record. It speaks to a very good process to follow. I just wonder if at a legal level, the IRB could argue that they are subject to it, or if that actually goes into following a different business process, which again, you have business process insurance that covers a lot of this as well. It's a really interesting question, and I'm glad I asked it, but definitely more to be discovered there. So let's work through that process now. So what you're talking about is you have the pre-screenings that are happening prior to the potential subject coming in. And you have the orange form, the green form, the blue form. Can you talk about each one again in a little bit more detail so that we can discuss how that feeds into the process of screening? And then how do you handle screen fails? Because let's be honest, every site is frustrated with sponsors who keep saying, we're going to only allow for a certain number of screen fails. So how does that work through?
So let me walk you through the patient flow, okay?
Yeah.
It starts with the website. You have to design a very good website. One that has a landing form on the top of your page, because most subjects are not going to scroll down, and one with a video that engages patients, either through a physician or someone who looks like the patient. And we do this through AI-generated videos and deep fakes. So what's cool about that is if there is a change that happened with the study, you can simply type the change and the AI avatar will change. You don't have to record a person doing it all over again and spend thousands of dollars doing that. So it's a very effective way of engaging patients. And what is the Turing test? Like a lot of people, those bots nowadays, they pass the Turing tests, no problem. Some patients do feel a difference, like but most people cannot tell the difference. And so, I even have my own AI bot that I use, I do have to admit, and it does work pretty well. People do think it's me sometimes.
Really interesting. We definitely got to bring you on and have a whole conversation about AI, because there's a bunch of stuff happening around AI as we speak, but that's a topic for a different day. So keep going, please. Thank you.
Oh yeah, we're very involved in AI, and we're a department of Annex Clinical, which is a computer data science research company. So we tap into that all the time. It's really interesting stuff. So regardless, the patient fills out the form, and they can read more about the study, about the drug, about what's involved and how much they get paid, right? Those are all things that have to be mentioned on the website. And once they fill out the form, they enter into an automated system that sends them text messages with brochures, emails, links to Calendly to book onto our pharmacist's, our pharmacist schedule. Once that happens, the pharmacist also uses automated methods to either do voicemail drops, or even what's cool is the moment the patient fills out a form, we time it so that the patient gets a voicemail in their inbox without their phone even ringing. So they get a missed call and a phone number from the missed call and a voicemail. That just happens all automatically from our pharmacist. So then our pharmacist uses the system to make phone calls to the patients. And if he gets a hold of them, then that's when he starts to pre-screen them. Now, the orange form essentially contains very basic information. For example, you're looking at medical history. You're looking at whether they have the disease. You're looking at con meds or concomitant medications. You're taking a look at their age, things like that. Very basic things.
Can I stop you there for a second?
Yes.
At this moment, do you feel like since you're getting patient-specific information, you now have to worry about HIPAA?
And that's why it's important to get a HIPAA waiver from the IRB. That allows us to collect patient information without them signing a HIPAA form.
Okay. So this happens pre-approval, pre-SIV, if you will, or technically after SIV. You're getting to the IRB and saying you want to give a waiver.
During your material submission, you request a HIPAA waiver from the IRB that allows you to engage patients and collect medical information without them signing a HIPAA form.
Okay, please continue.
And then once the patient is referred over to the site, the site, of course, asks the patient some more questions, asks the patient similar questions also to double check to make sure that it's correct. And because patients oftentimes say one thing on the phone, they say something different when they're at the site. And
so this is you've completed the orange form.
Yes.
And the patients are saying that they are not they potentially meet the screening process. So I'm going to challenge you again from a lawyer standpoint, but there is some research out there that suggests that sites are not subject to, clinical research is not subject to HIPAA at all. However, if that is true, the fact is that this person at this moment is not technically part of the research. So if that's true, and the IRB technically, going back to the position we had a few seconds ago, the IRB may not have jurisdiction over some of this. One might argue that since it's a a pharmacist having these initial conversations, and I assume it's a pharmacist, but I could be wrong, there is an argument maybe saying that is now a healthcare practitioner talking to a patient, and therefore the IRB is not in a position to give a HIPAA waiver, but it might be subject to HIPAA anyways because it's a patient to healthcare practitioner conversation. So it's an interesting, again, it depends on how you split this up and the conversation that happened, but I just thought it was an interesting thought process for me to go through, and maybe you can go, no, you're missing this part of it.
Right. Well, we're screening patients not to bring them into the practice as a patient.
Right.
We're screening them for the purpose of clinical trials, right? And typically, the only time we would request a HIPAA waiver, a HIPAA release form, is when we collect the patient's medical records at the site, right? Okay. Now, when we work with our sites, we have BAAs in place to protect, any confidential information. The systems we use are HIPAA compliant. So we still follow everything as if it's in a HIPAA environment.
Great.
But we still have to get the release from the IRB to make sure that we can still do this without a HIPAA waiver. We can talk to a patient about, their medical history, and they're openly talking to us about it, right?
Sure.
But we treat it as if it's PHI, right?
Correct.
It's not a casual conversation on the airplane, right?
Right. But the distinction is a casual conversation on the airplane is not between a healthcare provider and a non-healthcare provider and a patient in the perspective that they might be expecting to participate in some clinical research.
Right.
It's a different discussion altogether. different sort of sideline conversation. But what you've done at this point is finish the orange form. They've come onto the site, so it shows a commitment to participate in this research. If they do it right, you're filling out the green form. You're basically duplicating or verifying the information to make sure that what they said before is actually what they're saying, and you're going to then validate that against actual medical records as your next step. But
yes.
So please continue.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. The coordinator verifies that the information they provided is actually in the medical records. And that's another big challenge that we face, especially post-pandemic, is that a lot of healthcare practices, unless they have their EMRs, they just don't want to or don't have time to release medical information to the site. So that also causes more delays. And by that time, the patient loses interest So that's also where you still have to engage patient throughout the process. It still takes, so the challenge between the handoff between the pharmacist and the site is also challenging. And that's why built a system now where we were able to oversee site performance when it comes to engaging the patients once the handoff has happened, right? And we're able to track how often they call. Yep.
Just a quick question. So the pharmacist is doing the orange form. Is a nurse doing the green form? Is that what you're suggesting then?
Yeah, whoever the coordinator is, be it the nurse or medical assistant, whoever the coordinator is.
Got it. Okay. So you are getting multiple levels of healthcare practitioners reviewing this multiple times, which creates a more robust process, if you will.
Absolutely. And not wasting the coordinator's time, most importantly, right?
Yeah.
Because, the patient may not imagine the coordinator doing the pre-screen on the phone and then bringing them in, scheduling them, following up with them, and obtaining the medical records, double checking that. By having the pharmacist do it, you're not only getting to the point where the PI says, oh yeah, this is a good patient. Like, sometimes the nurse can bring in a patient or the coordinator bring in a patient. The PI doesn't think they're a good match because they're not likely to respond. So there's a lot of, by layering it this way, you're getting a lot of different aspects of quality to the pre-screening and screening process.
That sounds fascinating. That sounds amazing. So are you getting that? So are you getting a form that allows for the patient's records to be transferred over at the time of the orange form or after the green form is signed off?
After the green form is signed off. And usually the green form, it requires medical records review. So after the patient shows up, and we know they show up, right?
Right.
That's when we know that there's some level of commitment, right?
Okay. So now you've got to a point where you've got the person showing up, you've got the medical records. You've consented them as well at this point.
We consented them after the medical records, and then we go through the blue form.
Right. So now's the blue form. So now we know the subject is. So this is the actual screen at this point.
Yes, the actual screening visit, and we don't have to go through the previous steps because we already have documented all of that in the previous forms.
Yeah.
So you just go with whatever's left in the blue form, and here's your entire documented screening process to qualify the patient. Because another problem is that sites, especially independent sites where you have a lot of coordinator turnover, some patients end up in studies who are not supposed to be in studies because they missed one or two inclusion or exclusion criteria. And by putting that onto forms, it documents the process. So the monitors makes their job a lot easier too. They see, oh, okay, great, this patient qualifies. Oh, here's the medical record. Okay, we're done.
And do you communicate with the subjects when they say things like, we thought we could include you in the study, but you don't meet this criteria, which we hoped that you would? Is there a patient or a subject communication process if there's a failure, a pre-screen failure, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like the pharmacists are trained on the protocol, and so the coordinators, obviously. And you say, unfortunately, you do not qualify for the study. You know, and sometimes it's hard news for some patients, especially with terminal illness, right?
Yeah.
And they have no other options. It's sad, really, and unfortunate. But we do mention to them that we keep them in our list for other trials that may come along. And we do keep their records in our system.
Which is really interesting to me. And the reason it's interesting is because, number one, I think that sponsors, I've worked with several large sponsors, and one of the things they struggle with is this idea of how do you keep that loop going? How do you inform the subjects, for example, at the end of a study, to let them know, here's how your participation was, here's why your participation was so important. But no one talks about these initial processes where there are failures and the subjects still need to be communicated with. At a smaller site that may not have the same processes that you have, it's probably a simple thing of, oh, the person didn't qualify, we move on. And what you're doing is you have a process outline that goes, no, we have a communication, we let them know so that they can actually go back and do whatever they need to do. And as you pointed out, there is a established process for them to either find other studies or take whatever steps they need to take. I guess my last question.
I want to add to that oftentimes, you know, especially the smaller to mid-sized pharma companies, they oftentimes throw darts and say, we're going to target this particular disorder, right? Yeah. Because we think it might work also on this, or a variant of the same disorder. And that usually is great because we can apply those patients who did not qualify for one of their trials. We approach them for one of their other studies, and they do qualify. So it's just a difference. I think also one thing that's really critical to add here is analytical protocol optimization that sponsors oftentimes forgo, especially the smaller ones, where you take a look at real world evidence and real world data to compare the way your protocol is designed against the real world to see the chances of whether it's going to successfully enroll patients or not. And oftentimes sponsors learn that the hard way, where they throw it out, they see which patients do not enroll, they obtain the information from the screen fails, which is an EDC, by the way, not from systems outside of EDC. So then they amend the protocol. And then here you are 6-7 months later, still having enrollment issues when you could have saved that amount by doing an analytical optimization up front.
So we got to bring you back and talk about the analytical optimization, because that sounds like an absolutely fascinating topic. But I have so many questions to ask about so many more things. But we are literally about 15 minutes over time already.
Oh, so, wow. That's right.
But this was amazing. This was incredible. So let me ask you a few questions. Any parting words before we go?
I think from parting words, I say always pay attention to the patient when you're designing your protocols. Listen to what the patient's saying. Not only are regulators demanding this and requiring this, and a lot of the pharmaceutical industry is moving in that direction, but you know, patient representation is turning into a requirement by regulators now. So make sure you incorporate the perspective. Make sure you target the patients before you design your study, as I was mentioning, and analytical protocol optimization. Make sure there is minority representation in your studies, because that is also a thing that, you know, it's becoming a lot more studies are becoming a lot more inclusive, and we're seeing that the percentages of studies and patients do represent the actual minority populations, but still, especially smaller companies, again, tend to not focus on that as much as big pharma does. What else can I add? Automate as much things as you possibly can. Make sure there's a budget for study sites. For example, you know, a stipend like, you know, $500 or $1,000 a month for pre-screening activities as a salary. That will get study sites to prioritize your trial. That works really well. Your screen fail ratio, you know, I would say don't be stingy on that, especially if you're throwing a complicated protocol at a site and you know it's going to be tough to enroll, because sites are not going to focus on your study if you've got like a 1 to 3 screen fail reimbursement ratio, when you know that so many patients are going to screen fail and you won't even enroll one patient, right? So sites do not like that at all. I know it's not intentional, but they feel like it's kind of a bait and switch. And really, that's it. Engage your patients. Use automation technology as much as you can to reduce the burden. These technologies and processes are out there. You can build your own even.
Or reach out to you. Or reach out to you to help them build that.
Sure. We're here to help, even offering advice to sites and sponsors. I'm happy to share my advice.
Amazing. On that note,
these conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an attorney-client relationship.